I'd like to say a big thank you for signing up on my course. Hopefully you get what the course is about. I'm really happy with VPS servers, and I'd like to tell you why and what you can do with them and how you could replace other servers like cPanel, because these hosting providers that offer you some sort of managed solution, they just install some software and then they sit back. They don't really do anything. They just have software that does it for them. If something goes wrong, it's like, oh, I'm sorry. It just happens. There was a bug in this version. We've accidentally turned off HTTPS on all your websites. Sorry. It's not an official service we offer. So problems like this take me like half a day dealing back and forth with their ticket systems. Whereas a server that I manage, I can solve the problem in 5 minutes. It boggles the mind. So I'm trying to teach you guys how you can do this for yourselves. If you can do it for a couple, then you'll understand how easy it is. And maybe manually it's not the best way forward, but you could automate it. You just need to have an understanding of what it is and why you need to do it. And I'm hoping in this course that you'll appreciate that. I really hope you love this course. And if you don't, then tell me why. I can't improve the course if I don't know. But this is coming from me, and I've been doing these server setups for the last 10 years. So I'm trying to cram in as much information into this course as possible. I can't do it all at once, but I've tried to put in as much as I can at launch. And if I've forgotten anything, then again, drop me a message, ask a question in the Q&A, because I want to help and I would like this course to grow with everybody. Thank you and enjoy the learning. In this lecture, I'd like to talk about the different types of hosting. You've got shared hosting, dedicated hosting, and VPS hosting. So let's talk about those in a bit more detail. Shared hosting. This is where you have lots of people sharing the same physical hardware. Because of this, providers can cram a lot more users onto one box, and it slows everybody down a fraction, but most of the time people don't notice it. You do have some providers that when at peak times the server will crawl to a snail's pace. And this is because all the websites are generating traffic at the same time. If you pay a bit more money for a shared hosting, then you're less likely to come across this problem. If you go on hosting where you pay £1, $1 a month, then you're more likely to hit this problem. The benefit of shared hosting is it's cheap. Because of all these extra users, providers don't need to charge as much per user for the cost of the hardware, for the cost of the networking. So it's a trade-off whether you want to. If you don't mind your website going a little bit slow, then it's perfect. It's also easy because most of them have got a very simple user interface. And because it's simple, a negative would be the configuration is less flexible. You can do less things. They've got less things installed because the more flexibility they offer, the more chance of including a feature that could slow down a server. Because you've got all these users on one server, you've got a lot more chance of there being a security risk. If the server's badly configured, then any one of those users could then potentially attack your website and download your data, your database. The flip side of shared hosting is dedicated hosting. Dedicated hosting is where you own or you are the sole user of a piece of hardware, a physical server. Most of the time you can dictate what your operating system gets installed, which services get installed. I mean, usually you get given a server and then just told you can SSH in, here's your username and password, off you go. Usually you get support, but a lot of the time it's just hardware support. If you've got software problems, because you've configured that server, then you're a lot less likely to be able to. I mean, you can have what's known as managed dedicated hosting, which is where you have the shared hosting environment installed on your dedicated host. You'll have some of the negatives from shared hosting, like it's less flexible. You can't install what you want because the hosting provider doesn't understand it, doesn't support it, that sort of thing. Usually the biggest negative for dedicated hosting is that it's very expensive. You're usually talking a couple of $100 a month versus a few dollars. Which brings us on to the third type, VPS hosting, or virtual private server. This in a way is kind of a hybrid between shared hosting and dedicated hosting. There is a physical machine, but that's partitioned up. The hardware is kind of sliced up, and each segment has been given its own operating system. So they can guarantee you hardware resources of the CPU, the memory, the disk, this sort of thing. So it's a lot harder to over-provision this sort of thing. You tend to give one-to-one. So if you have a server with 16 cores in it, 16 CPUs, then you'd slice it up into 16 virtual servers, or 4 servers with 4 CPUs in it. So with a VPS, you have basic control of the hardware. It's usually just a slider sort of saying, I want 1 core, 1 CPU, 2 CPUs, and that will come with like 1-2 gigabytes of RAM. And that's enough to get you started. There usually is basic support, usually via ticketing or a phone, and you will tell them that you've got a problem with this and that, and they will help you to the best of their ability. Usually you're on your own with the community support, forums, this sort of thing. So why would I recommend VPS hosting over dedicated or shared? Well, I like to think that you get the best of both worlds. You get the cheapness of shared hosting, but it's not over-provisioned. You get the complete control of the software like you do with dedicated hosting. But you don't have everybody using your operating system, using your software, so there's less chance of being hacked from within. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about throughout this course, is how to set up a VPS and host your website on it. And at the same time, making it secure, or at least as secure as we can make it with today's known information. In the next lecture, I'll talk about the software that I'm going to install on it. In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about the software that I'm going to install on the VPS. I'm going to install Ubuntu, and I'm going to use the LTS 1604. The reason for this is because it's been around for a long time, it's stable, and it will be supported for another 3 years, which would take us to about 2021. So it will do us for another 3 years. Every good server that's doing website hosting needs a web server. And there's been a debate on the internet for almost as old as the internet now of which to use. And it usually comes down to Apache or Nginx. Apache was the current king, and then Nginx came along, and because it was faster at serving static files like images or video. Now, 5 years ago I started using Nginx and I stopped using Apache. And this was because it was quicker, but more importantly, I felt the config or the configuration was a lot simpler. So, for these reasons, I'm going to tell you how to use Nginx in this course rather than Apache. For a database, there's lots of choices. But I found MySQL is the best supported. And I also like some of the tools that I use on the Mac that connect directly to it, like SQL Pro. So I'm going to use MySQL for this course. One of the sites I'm going to use is Wordpress. We also need to install PHP. Ubuntu ships with PHP 7.0. And since Ubuntu shipped, 7.1 has been released, and 7.2, and I'm sure 7.3 soon. So what I'm going to do in a later lecture is show you how to install the latest version of PHP. And that is the basic software that I'm going to be using on this VPS. I'll see you in the next lecture. The internet isn't a safe place. Passwords are being brute forced, accounts are being hacked. It's not safe. So how do you connect to a server securely? What I use, and what most people do use, is something called SSH. And they use SSH keys instead of passwords. This is a lot more secure than just having some 8-character password or even a 20-character password. Instead of taking years to crack, would take centuries to crack, if not longer. So for this reason, let me show you how to generate an SSH key on a Mac or Linux. If you're on Windows, you need to use something called PuTTY, and I'll put in a link in the resources. So all you need to do is open up your command prompt, your terminal, and type in SSH keygen. And what that will do is it will generate your key pair. It will tell you where it's saving it. You just press enter. And in my case, I've already done this, so I don't want to overwrite it. When it's finished, you'll have these key pairs. And they will live inside your .ssh directory, inside your home directory. Let's make that a bit more obvious. Gosh. And you can see there, I created my SSH keys back in 2012. And what you'll need to do is you'll need the contents of your public key. ID_RSA is your private key, and ID_RSA.pub is your public key. The idea is your private key you keep 100% safe, you don't reveal it to anybody. Your public key, you can give it out to everybody, and they use that to verify that you are you based on some challenges they do between the two keys. So it's pretty secure. So what you'll need to do is view the contents of your public key, and in a later lecture you'll need to copy and paste that, and we can add it into, say, DigitalOcean or another server to allow automatic login. I'll see you in the next lecture. For my online hosting, I use a company called DigitalOcean. Their philosophy is very simple. They give you the raw computing power, and then you build something awesome on top. And that's reflected in their pricing. The ones I will be looking at are the standard droplets. And depending on your needs, you can pay as little as $5 a month, or you can pay as much as you want, have as many servers as you want. But for this course, I'm going to focus on the $5 a month one, which with the free credit, if you use my referral link, you can have at least a couple of months free without having to pay anything. And when you're testing, you don't need to spend a lot. But when you're in production, it might be that you need a little bit more oomph, a little bit more memory for caching, or more cores to enable your application to handle more traffic. But we can talk about that later. So you're going to want to sign up, but I already have an account, so let me log into mine. So I'm going to assume you have an account, and when you log in, this will be what you're greeted with. So the first thing you're going to want to do is create a droplet. And you want to make sure you're choosing Ubuntu 16.04. And we'll scroll down to the size, and for this purposes, we're going to choose the 1 GB, $5 a month. We don't need to worry about block storage. And for data center, you need to choose the location that's closest to your customers. I'm going to leave it on London. Additional options is great. You can have backups, which, as it says, it adds 20% to the monthly droplet cost. And it takes a backup once a week and retains the last 4 weeks. So it's pretty handy if you want to roll back. For these purposes, I'm not going to enable backups. However, I recommend that you consider it, and certainly if you're in production. For IPv6 rather, you don't need it. However, if you add it, it's a lot easier than adding it later. You don't have to take advantage of it, but if it's enabled, then at least you're assigned an IP address. Don't worry about user data. And I would recommend you turn on monitoring because it gives you some nice metrics about the CPU and memory utilization. SSH keys. With these servers, there are two different ways you can authenticate when you log in. One is with a username and password, and unfortunately most people know what the username is, which is root. So it could just be a matter of time. You can get around it by creating a second account and disabling login to root. However, what I like to do is use SSH keys. They're a lot harder to guess, in fact nigh on impossible, but you do have to look after them. If anyone gets your private key, then it's kind of game over. They can log into anything, you can. So I'm going to show you how to set up SSH keys on this server, which also has the nice side effect of disabling the password login. So we'll do new SSH key, and in here we just need to paste in your public key. So let's get the one we generated earlier. So we copy that, paste it in here, and give it a name so you remember which one it is. You can also edit your account to store your SSH keys, and next time you create a server it'll just appear here and you can just tick it rather than pasting it in every time. In this instance we're only going to want one server, so unless you're creating a whole load of servers at the same time, just leave this one as one droplet. And hostname, you can leave it as blank, or you can treat this as the reverse domain name. So if someone was trying to find the IP address and the hostname associated, this would be what would be resolved. So you can type in a full domain name here. This will only benefit you if you set your domain name to point at this server. And you can also add tags if you want, whatever you want to help you filter on the dashboard. So, and you just type it in, hit enter, and then hit create. And there you go. My server, my IP address, and if you click into it, we can just click on here, you can actually see everything about it. So if you want to turn it off. Snapshots is a good one. It's like backups, but you are in control of when you take them. So if you're going to do anything that you're not sure about, you can take a snapshot and you can always roll back to it. And that's it for this lecture. During this course, I'm going to be using DigitalOcean. However, if you don't want to use DigitalOcean, you can use any other provider as long as they provide you a VPS with SSH login. That said, there is also a free alternative. It won't allow you to test your server online, but if you just need it for local access and you only need it running on your computer, then you can use something called VirtualBox. And you can download it from here. And VirtualBox is supported on Windows, macOS, Linux, and others. All you need to do is download the package. You then need to install the package. And whilst we're here, we might as well get the extension pack. Let's download that as well. Let's install VirtualBox. So this is the Mac. It'll be different on the Windows computer. Okay, so let's install it. Oh, it's failed. I've been doing some reading on the internet, and it seems like there's new security procedures in the US that are stopping this. So let's sort that out. So you want to go to security, which is there, security and privacy. System software from Oracle was blocked from loading. So we just want to allow that. And now, hopefully, if we rerun the installer, we shouldn't have the same problem. And there we go. Seems to be working fine now. And we don't need the installer anymore, so we can move it to the trash. So we need to get a copy of Ubuntu. So we just need to go to Ubuntu, let's go to downloads, and we need to get the server version, not the desktop version. And we click download. So it'll take a little while to download. Okay, so that's downloaded. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to install the extension pack. So wherever it is on your desktop or your downloads directory, you just need to double click it. And that will ask you if you want to install it inside VirtualBox. I recommend you do read the terms and conditions, but when you do, click agree. This is just installing extra drivers to allow the machine to work slightly better. So let's create our first virtual machine. I'm going to call mine example machine. VirtualBox is trying to guess what type of machine I'm going to be installing, but as it's got Mac, it's kind of guessing it's a Mac, but we need to choose Linux and Ubuntu. If I'd named it Ubuntu, it would have picked it for us. And we're just going to use the same defaults as DigitalOcean. So that's 1 GB of RAM. And the hard drive, we're going to choose 25 GB. But because it's a dynamic drive, it doesn't matter. It's not going to take up the whole 25 GB until you actually start using that within the virtual machine. So let's quickly go into the settings. I want to make sure that we've got one core, which is exactly what we've got in DigitalOcean. Audio, I'm going to disable because we don't need audio. And storage, we need to basically choose the ISO that we've just downloaded from Ubuntu. And we just say OK to that. Now what we need to do is start the virtual machine, and if everything's gone to plan, it will boot up. So you just need to choose the language you're most comfortable with, and hit enter, enter again. And for a lot of these defaults, you're just going to be choosing enter or using the arrow keys to move around. I'm not too worried about detecting the layout because your operating system will be doing that for you, as in your host operating system. This install is going to be slightly different to the DigitalOcean one, but it's mostly because DigitalOcean will have customized their install to remove a lot of the extras that Ubuntu server may be coming with, or they may have added in a few extras of their own. That's networking being configured. This is just like the DigitalOcean host name. You can have whatever you want, but again, I'm just going to call the example exactly the same and hit enter. This doesn't have the niceties of asking you for an SSH key to start with. You're going to have to create a user that you can then escalate to root to do all your editing. So I'm just going to go with Daniel, and then I'm going to choose a password and hit enter, and then again repeat the same password. And no, I don't want to encrypt it. Yes, the time zone is correct. And again, unless you know what you're doing, I would just stick with the defaults for how to format your disk. And you need to say yes, write the changes to the disk. And hit enter again. Finally say yes again. Okay, unless you connect to a proxy to use the internet, let's leave this blank. Whether you want to install automatic updates is up to you. Installing security updates automatically won't make sense unless this virtual machine is on all the time. But for simplicity, it's probably better to just leave it as no automatic updates and then you manually run the updates later, which I'll go over in another lecture. And what we need to do here is we need to turn on OpenSSH server. So what you do is use the arrow keys and then the spacebar to select and deselect. And that is it. Oh, and hit tab to come down to the continue. And then hit enter. And this is going to install all the system packages and the SSH. Because by the end of this we will be connecting to it the same way as we do the DigitalOcean server. And finally you do need to install the grub loader, the grub bootloader, because that's how your virtual machine boots. And let's hit continue to reboot. Okay, so logging in is a simple matter of remembering the username and password that you set. Okay, and that's you logged in. You can log in this way, but I find this terminal a little bit clunky. You can't resize it as much as you want. The copy and paste sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. So what I recommend is logging out of this. However, one thing we do need to know is what your IP address is. And you can see it there, 10.0.2.15. Now, you can carry on using this interface if you want, but I prefer to use my native terminal. So let's log out and forget this exists. And if I load up terminal, here's one we had earlier, and we type SSH Daniel 10.0.2.15. And it doesn't work. Right. Let's load up VirtualBox again. Quickly go into settings, network. Alright, let's try bridged adapter. And then we'll choose the Wi-Fi that I'm using. In your case, it could be an Ethernet port. Let's do that. Let's reboot this box just to be sure. Okay. So what we've done is we put the virtual machine directly on the network, which is why the IP address has changed format. So in this case, it's 192.168.1.131. So let's try that. Okay, because we've never connected to this virtual machine before, we don't know what the fingerprint is. The computer's way of identifying the remote server. So let's just say yes, because we know. Type in your password, and there we go. You've got a much better terminal right here. Now, to get to the state where we are with DigitalOcean, or where we'll be in the next lecture with DigitalOcean, we need to create a directory called SSH. And inside there, we need to put a file called authorized_keys. And all that we need in there is our SSH key. Now this is something that DigitalOcean will have done for us. And then you just hit Control X, press Y to save, and hit enter. Now, if we log out and we reconnect, we shouldn't be prompted for the password. So let's have a look at what's happened. What we've done is we've created the authorized keys file, but we've not put it in the SSH folder. So let's type move authorized keys.ssh, and that's going to move it into there. So now if we exit and now connect, there we go. We're now connected without requiring the password. But there's one more thing that DigitalOcean will do, is that we'll be connecting directly to the root user, and for this we need to go via our user. So to get to the root user, we just need to type sudo -s, and that will give us super user doing with a shell. So if we type that and then we type our password, that is where we will be with DigitalOcean. So if you see me connecting to DigitalOcean as root at IP address, then you need to follow the steps here. You need to type SSH, your username, at your local IP address, and then type sudo -s followed by your password. I'll see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, I want to take a minute to talk about passwords. I've briefly spoke about using SSH keys to log in, and I've said passwords aren't necessarily the best thing to use. But I want to talk about why. The trouble with passwords is you can brute force them. And by brute forcing I mean you try all A's and then the last one being B, all A's and then the last one being C, and keep going. Computers are very good at this. And humans are really bad at choosing unique passwords, which is why we've got password complexity. Like, your password needs to be at least 8 characters. It needs to use uppercase and lowercase, and include a number, and include a symbol. And this makes it really hard for people to remember the password. So people are using password managers. We can bypass that with SSH keys. But let's talk about why. Let's talk about bits of entropy. If you created a 7-character password, that's 40 bits of entropy. To a computer, that's just binary. It calculates its way through it, and assuming that the system allows you to check the password as often as you want, then that password could be broken in 20 minutes, or within 20 minutes. If your password was 7 characters, and was alphanumeric and included a symbol, and that's assuming your password was 7 characters and included alphanumerics and symbols. If the same password was 11 characters long, that'd be 64 bits of entropy. And then you're looking at nearly 585 years to crack that password, which is not bad. But if you use a dictionary word, then that's dramatically lower, because computers can easily figure that one out. They just need a dictionary. Even if you just start substituting A for the @ symbol or L's for ones, there's a lot less possibilities, combinations that you could be using. When you create an SSH key, you're likely to get 2048 bits of entropy. And if you think going from 40 bits to 64 bits went from minutes to years, think what going from 64 bits to 2048 bits will do. It is unfathomable that you could brute force that. Maybe in the future with quantum computers, but at this moment in time, SSH keys give you the best possibility for securing your server. So I'm going to tell you how to turn off password authentication, because if you're with DigitalOcean, you should have put this SSH key in creation. If you didn't, you can follow the free alternative in the last lecture to add your key into the authorized keys file. So let's assume that you've done that. You've done the authorized keys file so you can log in with your SSH key or your password. Well, if you're using SSH keys, great. But then you've still got the possibility of logging in with your password, so somebody could still brute force you. Let's turn off password authentication. Let's grab the IP address again. And this is the first time I've connected to this DigitalOcean box. And what we want to do is type nano etc ssh and then sshd _config. And if we scroll down, we're looking for password authentication. Now, mine says password authentication no. And that means SSH will not allow passwords. By default, you'll probably see password authentication with the hash symbol in front of it. That means that it's commented out and it has no effect. So you'll need to remove the hash symbol and also make sure this says no. And then you'll need to exit out, Control X, press Y, and then press enter to write the file. Now you've updated the config, but SSH is still running in the background and it won't have made any difference. So you need to restart SSH, which is service SSH restart. And now you'll no longer be able to log in with that password. By doing this, there is one less avenue that an attacker can attack your server. I'll see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, I want to take a moment to talk about the package manager. The package manager for Ubuntu is called Aptitude, or APT for short. So let's reconnect to the server. Now, we've logged in, and the first thing I can see is there are 27 packages that can be updated, 3 of which are security updates. So that's not great, because ideally we want to keep on top of, at very least, the security updates. Now, there's a command called apt update, and all this does is gets Aptitude to update its source of information. It lets it know what versions are available. By default, I believe Aptitude will be once a day running this update, but we can do it manually and it won't hurt. And you can see actually it was a little bit behind because there's now 28 packages that can be upgraded instead of the 27. So how can we upgrade the packages? Well, as it says, you can type apt list upgradable. But I tend not to worry too much, and I just tend to run apt upgrade. And this will tell you which ones will also be upgraded with a little less information, so you don't get the version number. But most of the time you don't care. So let's say yes, we want to upgrade them. It's best to do this kind of like once a week. But bear in mind, if an update happens to a service that you're relying on, like MySQL or the web server, then when it applies it, it will have to take it down and then to apply it. So you could have a brief outage. You also have apt auto remove, and that removes things that are no longer needed. which we saw earlier. So we say yes to that one as well. You've also got apt clean, but we haven't really downloaded or installed anything, so there's nothing really to clean. If you want to search for anything, sort of any package, then you have apt search. And it will basically do a plain text match and try and find you as much as possible that matches. So you can see the top answer there is actually the Figlet is what I was looking for. And you've also got apt install, and that will install the application that you were looking for. So the package manager is fairly standard, and we'll be making extensive use installing packages, but just remember to keep them updated, because it's the security updates that will keep you secure. The other updates are just sort of potentially adding features, but most of the time fixing bugs, certainly in an LTS. Another thing we can install is NTP, the Network Time Protocol. Yes. And what this will do is keep you in sync with, well, keep your clock in sync, because sometimes clocks can drift, and that makes debugging with logs, error logs, quite hard. So the time date control, set time zone. I like to use UTC because it's the easiest one to work with. If you want to use your native time zone, then feel free. This process will periodically check your date and time and correct it if necessary. Alright, I'll see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, I want to talk about the skeleton directory. The skeleton directory in Linux, it is the directory used to create a new user folder. So anything in there gets copied across when a new user is created. So let's check it out. We'll connect to the server, and its location is /etc/skel. So you can see in there's already a few files. But one of the tricks I've got is if we create an SSH folder in there, and inside there an authorized keys file, we can log directly into any new user we create. So let's do that. So we'll make a directory .ssh, and we'll change the permissions of that to 0700, which just means only the owner of that folder has full read and write permissions. So, and what we can do is, if you're happy with your authorized keys file, you can copy that to here. So let's check that out. So there you go. You can see the .ssh folder with read and write permissions for the owner, the RWX. And if we go into the .ssh folder, let's check it out. We now have the authorized keys file, and in there will be the original key that you created. If you have more than one machine, you can copy those in. So whichever computer you're on, you can log into from it. So now, when you create a new user, you'll be able to log into it just as you've logged into root. And it will just be user @ and then the server IP address or server name. And I'll see you in the next lecture. In the last lecture, we set up the skeleton directory. So in this lecture, let's set up the web server. And as I said in the beginning, we're going to be using Nginx. Now I don't want to use the Nginx that comes with Ubuntu LTS because it's getting a little bit old, and I don't see any harm in using the latest stable release of it. So we need to add something called a PPA. And to do this, let's connect to the server. And what we need to do is type add apt repository. And then we need to type ppa nginx/stable. So this is telling us that these are the only chips they support, and these are the distributions of Ubuntu they support. So if you're happy to proceed, and I know I am, then hit enter. And when you add a PPA, you need to do apt update, just to let Aptitude pull in the latest sort of file changes from them. And now we can do apt install nginx. And this is going to tell us exactly what it's installing. As Y is the default, we can hit enter. And this will install nginx for us. I'm going to show you a quick minor change to nginx config. So we take server tokens and make them off. This is just so we don't advertise which version of nginx we're currently using. It's just a minor thing to aid a little bit in security. And if you Control X and Y to save. In a later lecture we'll be configuring nginx, but for now we're going to move on to installing your database and PHP. Let's talk about nginx config. Let's connect to the server first of all. And nginx config lives in /etc/nginx. Now in here you've got some bits and pieces. We've already had a look at the nginx.conf, which we removed the signature, the version numbers. You also have conf.d, and inside that directory is configuration you want loaded for globally. You have a snippets folder, and inside snippets, that is configuration you want to include on a site-by-site basis. You've got fastcgi params and fastcgi.conf. They are mostly the same, but there's a subtle difference, and fastcgi_params is there for legacy issues. You've got some various other parameter files which we're not going to touch on. You've got modules, which we haven't got any installed, but the idea is if you install modules, they'll be available, and then you can link them or symlink them into modules enabled. We're going to be talking about how to do that for sites available and sites enabled. Right, so let's go on to the sites available. By default, you have a default website. And by default, this website is not very exciting at all. But this could serve as your holding page or your under maintenance page. So if a site's not configured or somebody just types in the IP address. Yesterday I created an A record so that example.ovdan.com pointed to my server, as you can see from the URL. And how is this controlled? Well, it's controlled from this default file. And in here, it's very basic. It's listening on port 80, which is HTTP. And this config here with the double colons is it telling it to listen on IP6 or IPv6 as well. And the default server means that if nginx can't match anything else, it's going to use this configuration, which is why it's a catch-all site. You've also got here root, which is where nginx will look for all the web files. So we can have a look at that in a minute. Server name _. Again, that's another way of sort of saying match everything. And you've got location slash. Location slash is a prefix match, so anything after that, it will match slash. If you had slash welcome, it would only match slash welcome slash something or other. not slash, not the home directory. So this location block matches absolutely everything. And inside you've got try files. And what that means is try these parameters, and if not, if they don't match anything, finally do this. So it's going to look for a file, which is what the $URI is, inside that root directory. It will then look for a directory called whatever you're passing in. And finally, if it finds nothing, it will return a 404. And that's a HTTP response code. So that could easily be a 403 for forbidden, or 500 for an internal server error. And for me, I tend to put a 500 in there or something similar so that Google doesn't cache my holding page or my maintenance page. Before I carry on, I was just going to show you the root directory for the default page. So that was in var www HTML. And you can see in there is a single file. And that, if you want to change, you can change. So if you want to, we change that, and if we look at engine, and if we look at the holding page again, there you go. It's very simple. You've just got to come with some creative style. You could also upload some images to that directory. I would recommend keeping it static and don't try to make it dynamic, because you don't want to introduce any security problems in your holding page. In this lecture, we're going to install MySQL. So let's jump right in. We're going to type apt install MySQL-server. And this is going to install MySQL Server 5.7. I'm not too fussed about pulling in the latest changes for MySQL because not a lot has changed. There is a big release coming out soon, which is MySQL 8, but I'm waiting to see what happens with that. So for the moment, we're going to stick with 5.7. And if we just hit Y or enter, which is the default, you need to choose a secure password. Something that you're going to remember because you're going to need to log into it potentially to give you an overview of all your databases. But it needs to be secure enough that nothing can brute force your password. The risk of it being brute forced is a lot less than with SSH, because we're not going to expose MySQL to the world. But still, a malicious script on your server could be checking your MySQL and trying to brute force a connection without you even noticing it. So I would recommend a good strong password. But at the moment I'm going to just choose a very simple password. And there you go, MySQL is installed. And it's also running. In the next lecture we'll install PHP. In the previous lecture I mentioned MySQL 8. And I've given it a bit of time, and it's been out. It was out in April 2018, and there's been a few releases since then. What I'm going to do is tell you how to install MySQL 8. I'll leave it up to you to decide whether you want MySQL 8 or MySQL 5.7. However, what I would recommend you do is not do this on a server that you use in production. So I would recommend you duplicate your existing server, and you can do that with DigitalOcean by using either backups or snapshots, and finding the right snapshot, you can create a droplet from it. It will spin up exactly like your existing server. You need to make a note of the password they give you, because it's going to force you to log in and change your password, And unfortunately, even if we've disabled password logins, they still need you to change your password. So make a note of that so you can reset your password. Okay, so once your server's spun up, make a note of the IP address. So the first thing you need to do is go along to mysql.com, and when you're there, you can click on Downloads, and we want to configure our apt repository. So click on apt repository. And this will tell you which versions it works with. So we're using 1804, which is great. And it has MySQL 8 in there. So the first thing you need to do is click on download, but we don't want the actual file, we want to copy and paste that link. What I will say is this works better if it's a fresh installation, so if you're setting up a new server rather than migrating. But it should work either way. The issue you'll get is potentially with applications. First thing we need to do is get that file. Now, you could just type this in manually rather than going through the whole getting the link from the previous website. However, sometimes the version numbers increment, so it makes sense to get the latest version. So you have a deb file, and now we need to install it into your apt repository. So we'll type dpackage -i for installation, and then we'll just give it that file and hit enter. So I've already installed 5.7, so I'm going to need to change this. If you haven't installed MySQL before, then it should default to MySQL 8. And then we just go down and OK. And once that's done, you just need to do apt update and apt install MySQL server. But in my case, because I've already got it installed, okay, it's happy to upgrade it even though I had it installed. But you can see there that it's removing my MySQL 5.7 and it will install the MySQL server, which is version 8. This is where you're going to end up with problems. The strong encryption, which is great, and you should be using it. However, older applications might have struggle. And this is why I recommend trying this out in a temporary machine. Because you don't know which ones are going to work and which ones aren't. So this is entirely up to you. But the legacy ones is going to allow you to migrate your current applications whilst getting the latest version of MySQL. If your application doesn't work, it won't connect. It will throw up some error, and it won't work until it's been updated to support this. So, okay that. And there we go, we're running MySQL 8. So now you should be able to either install MySQL Server 5.7 or install MySQL Server version 8. I'll see you in the next lecture. Let's install PHP. Let's reconnect. And for this one, we will be using a PPA because PHP is fast moving. When 1604 was released a couple of years ago, you had 7.0. We've now got PHP 7.2. So it makes sense to get the latest one. So we need to use add apt repository and it PPA :Andre/PHP. And all this is saying is that you need to, they only provide supported releases of PHP. So let's hit enter to carry on. And like last time, we need to do apt update. And let's have a look at what we've got. So we can do a list And you can see here all the different PHP options you have. So let's look at 7.2. You've got the main version, you've got FPM, which is what we're going to use, and a few other modules. So let's just install some of the basic modules. So apt install PHP 7.2 FPM, PHP 7.2 XML, PHP 7.2 international support, and we're going to need PHP 7.2 MySQL. I think we should also get PHP 7.2 opcache. And whilst we're here, why not get JSON? And probably a good idea is to get GD, which allows PHP to manipulate graphics. We don't need to pick everything at once, but these are some of the common ones that you'll probably need later. We can always install more at a later date. So let's just install those. Okay, let's have a look. And there you go, you've got PHP running. It's using its default config, which is why you've got pool www, but we'll change that later. One per website. And before we go, I want to tweak the config to basically not expose PHP. So what we're looking for is expose PHP. Okay, by default it's already off, but it's worth double checking, because if it's on, you'll be saying this was generated using PHP with this version. If it's off, then an attacker needs to guess. So we save. That's it for this lecture and all the dependencies. We'll move on to actually setting up a website in the next lecture. We've now installed PHP, but a lot of PHP is now starting to come distributed with something called Packagist, and this is a package manager for PHP. In the past, if you had a dependency in your code, then you'd need to go and find the library and install it and do it all manually. This was okay. The trouble was you didn't know if there was a later version, or you could look, but nobody really did. So you had a library to deal with zips or images, and you shipped it with your application, and that's it, you forgot about it. Sometimes you have multiple copies of the same library because you forgot about it in the same project. So a lot of clever people came up with something called Composer. And this is a package manager for PHP. And you know a project uses Composer if the README mentions it, or if there's a composer.json file or composer.lock file in the project root. And that's just a file that tells you and Composer what the dependencies of this application is, or of this project. So what we need to do, because a few of the projects I'm going to install use Composer, is we need to install it ourselves. So the first thing we need to do is head over to Get Composer. And you'll see a website similar to this. And you need to tell it you want to download. Now, here is the installer file, or in this case, script. So we're going to copy and paste that. Now, this all uses PHP, so you need to have done the previous step of installing PHP. And let's go over to the server. And where are we? We're in our root directory, which is great. So we paste all that in, and that should give us a composer.far. Now, You can use that, but you need to make it in a more accessible place for every user of your website. So the first thing we need to do is we're going to move it to USR local bin. And if you want to call it composer.far, great. For me, I like to change the name. I like to just call it composer. So now when you type in composer, you'll see it. Obviously it's warning us there not to run it as root, but that's as simple as it is to install Composer. But it will save your PHP projects a phenomenal amount of dependency management. I'll see you in the next lecture. I know when I set up servers, I don't know all the possible websites I'm going to host on it when I first set it up. For that reason, I'm trying to design this course so that you go through the course once per user per website. So that every time you need to set up a new user, you can go through and then sort of pick your own adventure for different types of website, for different types of config. And I'm hoping that this will allow you to extract more value from this course. So this section is all about setting up the website user and the PHP config that goes with it, because that's not going to change too much. The PHP config, you'll be changing a few values, yes, but Nginx config can get quite complex, so we'll talk about that in another section. In this lecture, I want to talk about how, so far, all we've done is set up a few dependencies. Why don't we now set up our first user? The way I treat users when I set up servers is each website is encapsulated with a single user. That way, if a website has been attacked, there's very little they can do. They could potentially brute force MySQL, but hopefully put a secure password when you create them, or your root user for MySQL. We've turned off SSH. We've turned off user passwords. There's potentially some config for Nginx and PHP they could look at. Arguably they can't do any damage with it, but it would give them more intel to attack other websites. In another lecture, we'll look at hardening your server against this. So let's add this user. And as I say, this is a particular one for a website. So let's connect to the server, and I'm going to set up example.ovdan.com because it's what I named the server. It makes sense, it's the first website. So what we need to do is type user add -d, and this is the home directory, and I tend to put everything in var www, and then I give it a home directory, and I typically use the domain name. We also want to give it a group users. This will help us later. And we're using -m to get it to make the user directory. And this will also copy in the shell directory which we modified earlier. -s to give it a shell. bin/bash is good enough. And then the username. This could be example. I tend to go with the domain name, so ovdan, or the domain name _ subdomain. So I'm going to go with ovdan _ example. This way it's easier to remember which user to log into which website. If you enter, and then that's been created. So if we have a look in var www example, and there you go. That is exactly like the skeleton directory. We also want to change the group that owns this folder to www.data. So this will let Nginx get into the folder and also stop other users being able to get in. And just to complete it, we need to type chmod and change the permissions to read and write execute for the owner, read and execute for Nginx, and for everybody else, no permission. You should put the 0 at the front. It can be inferred without it, but... And again. And one last step. If we log into this user, we can also type SSH keygen. And this will give us a private key and a public key for this particular user. So if we use Git to deploy later, we can use this particular one. So that's it for the user creation. In a later lecture, we'll talk about how to put your web files in there. In this lecture, we're going to talk about setting up the PHP config. Now, not every website needs PHP. It could be a static website with just HTML and images. Okay, you don't need PHP, so don't bother with this step. If you're using WordPress or Symfony, then you're going to need PHP. So I'm going to assume I'm going to need PHP for this example website. So let's connect to the server. And what we need to do is go into the PHP directory. And in here will be a folder for each version of PHP. We installed 7.2, so there's only 7.2 here. But what happens if we installed 7.2 and 7.1? Well, you'd have config for both. And you can actually run both versions of PHP very happily on the same server. But it will come down to how you configure them to see whether it will work. And we'll go over that in a bit. So let's go into the 7.2 directory. And in here, you again have two different directories. I mean, mods available is just all the different modules that are available, which are linked to, so ignore that directory. The other two directories, CLI and FPM, CLI is the PHP configuration for the command line. Now, most of the time, you don't need to worry about that. FPM is what we use to connect Nginx to PHP. So that is where the config lies that we need to modify. The FPM config is pretty much, you're not going to need to change it. It's how PHP spawns new pools. So you can see at the bottom there, that's where the pool directories live. But a lot of these configs you're not going to need to change. You may change them later on when you know a lot more about it, but for this moment in time, don't touch. What else do we have in here? You've got the conf directory, and that is where the modules are linked in that we saw a minute ago. So if you want a new module installed, apt will be putting a link in here to the module. You can also go into one of these and put module specific config in there. So if we look at the MySQL one, it's mostly just telling it where the config is. So lastly, we have the pool.d directory. And this is where your website PHP configuration is going to live. The www one is the default one. You can use that for every single one of your websites. The trouble is, it's running with generic permissions, which would mean if one website got hacked, they have the potential to attack all your websites. And that's something we don't want. We're going to run PHP as the website user. And that means that user is almost locked into that directory. The only thing it will be able to see outside is anything that's been given everybody or world permissions to read. So let's go into the www one. In here is a list of all the parameters, or most of the parameters, that you can change with explanations. And we are going to be typing a lot of these in but I'll explain what they are. But if you want more explanation, you can look at this file and it'll be able to help you. But when you're ready, I would recommend removing that file. You can copy and paste it somewhere else for reference, but we don't need it, and it's going to be taking up resources on your server in terms of memory, mostly memory, but potentially CPU. The website we want to configure is ofdan_example. So let's type that in. And hopefully you've noticed I'm keeping the username consistent with this PHP. And that's a theme I'm going to be using. Again. And this is what will be listed under pool if you were to do that list of processes. So the first thing we need to do is we need to tell it to run as the ofdan user. We need to give it a group of users, which was the default group we gave it when we created that user. We need to tell it where the sock file is, or the socket, and this is how we're going to communicate with Nginx. So we're going to say var run PHP, and we're going to give it a version number, fpm.ofdanexample.sock. We're going to need to remember that path for when we set up Nginx. And also, by including the version number of PHP in that file, we can run multiple versions of PHP. So in the future, when PHP 7.3 comes out, and by default we will have no websites running for it, no pools. And what we could do is we can copy across this file, but changing that version number, and we could have both running. And then we could test with Nginx to see that that website works or not in the new version. And then when we're happy, we can then remove the old config file, restart PHP, and then you can slowly move your websites from the old version of PHP to the new version of PHP. Or maybe you want PHP 5.6, which is still supported at the moment, because it doesn't work in PHP 7. With this, you have a lot of flexibility. And we need to say who can listen, or who can answer. We also need to say who is allowed to use this socket file. So what we'll say is only www.data can, and that's Nginx. And again with the group. And we'll confirm that with the permissions. And we'll say the mode is 0660. So only the owner and the group are allowed to read and write to this. And we'll also say allowed clients 127.0.0.1. So they have to be on the server to be able to make this connection. Though that may only apply if it's a port number. And for my example, I'm going to use the dynamic. In my example, the process mode is going to be dynamic. Dynamic allows it to shrink and grow based on traffic or number of requests. You've got static, which whatever you define coming in the next few lines, it won't change regardless of how little or how much traffic. And you also have on demand, which means if you have no traffic at all, they'll get killed off and you'll have no PHP running until the first request. So let's define some limits. Max children. Max children is the total number of PHP processes that will be allowed to run. And we want to say, let's start 2. But we only want 1 spare. So if one stops being used, then it will stay. if one gets killed off, it'll then restart another one just to maintain that you've still got one spare. And then you've got max spare servers. Oh, missed an S off there. So maybe we won't want 2. You also have max requests. And this is how many requests that each process deals with before it then gets killed off. It's to stop things like memory leak. So if you've got a process that leaks memory, the memory can be freed up by killing off the actual PHP process. I will also link you to the documentation in PHP that explains a lot more about this. And you've got websites that tell you how you should calculate these numbers. But I can't really help you with how to calculate these numbers because it depends on how little or how much traffic you're going to get, how heavy your application is. Maybe you only need a few requests, but they need hundreds of megabytes each, in which case if you've got a gig of RAM, you could only run 5 because they'd be using 200 megas each, or maybe you only use 10 megs, which means you could run 100 of them before it maxes out. Well, you also have the problem if you've got loads of websites, then you're going to be running these as well. So it's kind of a juggling act, which is why I've got dynamic, but on demand could work, because if you've got a website that only gets traffic once an hour or only for 1 hour a day, and most of the time it's idle, then you could free up that memory and reuse it somewhere else. So I'll link you to some resources that help you try to understand what numbers you should be using. But as a starting point, this will get you going. So created a user for the website. Does your website need a database? If it does, then you'll need to do this step, which is create a user and a database for this website. So we need to connect to our server as root. And what we'll need to type is MySQL-u for user, which is root-p to prompt us for the password. Now hopefully you remember the password from earlier when you set up MySQL. So enter it now. There you go. This is MySQL. And what you need to do is type create database, and what we need is these backtick symbols. You can do it without, but it's safer to do it with, just in case you come across some characters that MySQL is not entirely happy with that isn't escaped. And we're going to keep the consistency, and we're going to call it ofdan_example, and don't forget the semicolon. We now need to say create user, and this time using quotes ofdan example close quotes at, and this time we're going to say localhost identified by, and this will be the password. Now again, this password does need to be reasonably secure because you don't want it to be brute forced by another user. So I've personally created a website that generates passwords, passwords.ofdan.com. So if we use one of these and paste it in here, and again not forgetting the semicolon. We have a database, we have a user, but we need to tell MySQL that this user has access to this database. We do that by saying grant all on ofdan example dot star. So this is the database, and the star is for every table. And this is the same as the user. And there we go. If at any point you want to change the password, you can log in again and you can just say set password for of Dan example at localhost equals and then password, and then paste your password in there, and then that will reset the password to whatever you provide. If you make changes to the users, the permissions or the password, you also need to type flush privileges. Otherwise, MySQL is still using the old settings, just like you did if you changed the config for Nginx or PHP. So that's your user and your database. Make a note of those and your password, because you'll need them for when we install WordPress later on. I'll see you in the next lecture. In this section, I'm going to talk about how to deploy your website. Now, I can't talk about every possible way of deploying it, every possible framework, so I'm going to pick a few. If I've missed something that you're struggling with, then feel free to drop something in the questions and answers, drop me a message, and ask if I can do a lecture on your particular framework or your method of deployment. If I get enough people that want the same thing, then I will record a lecture on it. But I'm hopeful that because I'm doing the basics, that we'll cover most of the bases. And you won't need to do every single one of these lectures for each website. You need to just pick one, just like you did in the previous section with the Nginx config. So choose your adventure. I'll see you in the next lecture. You've got all your config, your web server's set up. How do you deploy a website? Previously, we've been SSHing in using root, but what I suggest is we log in as the actual user this time. And there you go, we're straight into the website's user. So this is one way we can do it. So I'm going to remove the htdocs, but this is only necessary if you've installed something before. And let's assume that we had a zip file, or in this case a gzip file, of WordPress, and we're trying to install it. What we could type is wget https wordpress.org/latest.tar.gz. That will download the latest version, and then you could unzip it like latest, and we have a look. We've got a WordPress folder, so if we remove that install file and we'll move WordPress to the htdocs folder, that's how you install WordPress using wget. But I wouldn't be very good if I only showed you how to install WordPress. So next, I'll show you a different way to get the file onto your server. In this lecture, I want to talk about how you can upload your web files from your computer. So you've created a website on your computer, it looks great, and now you want to upload it. I'm going to tell you how to use SCP, or Secure Copy, and I'll show you both ways to do it. Because you can use the command line, which is a doddle, or you can use an SCP client, or you can use an SCP application. On the Mac, it's CyberDuck. On Windows, it's called WinSCP or FileZilla. In a previous lecture, we talked about the default page. And I modified it just to show you where it was. But that's not something I want to leave running. So on my computer, I've created a basic index HTML and logo, like here. So how do I go about getting that online? What I can do is I can type scp and then I give it the location of the files, which are on my desktop, default, and everything in that folder, and we just tell it where we want to put them. So let's type in my server IP address. So that's the username, the server IP address, colon, and then the folder where they're going. So in this case it was var www html. If you're doing this for an actual website, you'd put the username, for example, of Dan_example at IP address or domain name, and then it would be colon var /www/ domain name /htdocs. So it's very similar, but in this case we're doing the holding page. And then you just hit enter, and then your files will get uploaded. As you can see, it was a very small file. And if we reload, there you go, that's my holding page. If you want to do it with a GUI, then it would just be as simple. There are many connection options, but what you're looking for is SSH file transfer protocol, or SFTP or SCP, anything that's using the SSH, because that's where the secure bit comes from. So again, it would be type in the IP address. In this case, type in root. We're not using the password because we're going to use keys. So we just tell it which key we want to use, and you can hit connect. And then you just choose the folder you want. Or better yet, you can set up a bookmark to get you into the right folder each and every time. But there you can see the folders. I know in a previous lecture we edited the index Nginx Debian file, but the index.html overrides this, so it's irrelevant. So we can remove this file, not a problem. And you could just drag your files in. And you just tell it to overwrite. That's the alternative way you can actually upload these files. It might be tempting to upload your web files directly to here using the root user, because you've got access to every single website. Please don't do that. Because what you'll do is you'll upload the files and it will look like it works, but those files will be owned by root. So the next time you try and do it with the correct user, you'll get permission denied problems. So stick with one user, one website, just to keep it simple. And with other frameworks, it gets even more complicated because you've got cache and they like to store it inside the htdocs folder. And if you've uploaded that folder with root, they will no longer be able to write their cache. So one user, one website. We've seen how to deploy using wget and scp. One way I like to use is using something called Git. It's a version control system. So I'm going to show you how to deploy using that. And what we're going to do is we're going to deploy an application I wrote a couple of years ago called the password generator. So it's this application. And this is the repository for it, or the Git repo. So if we scroll down to the bottom, keep going, we've got some installation steps. We can either use Composer, Git, or we can download the repository ourselves as a zip file. Well, we've already done this step. I'm going to show you the Git one now, and in the next lecture I'll show you how to do the Composer one. So what we need to do is copy this line, git clone, and then the repository URL. Well, how do you know what the URL is if they don't tell you? Well, if you're on GitHub or any other repository that uses Git, then you've got a clone or download option. It'll be around somewhere. You can either use SSH or HTTPS. If you're doing it a lot, I would recommend using SSH, but you will have to set up potentially some tokens. It depends on how many requests you make. If you use HTTPS, it's a lot easier to get started. But for our purposes, either will work, and we can use the one that is at the bottom here. So if we load up terminal, and obviously we want to go into our user. Let's double check there's no htdocs in there for us. Great. And that is Git downloading the repository for us. So let's have a look. Well, it's downloaded it in a directory I didn't want that directory. When we did the Git clone, I could have typed a directory at the end and that would have been the directory it created for us. However, I didn't. So let's just move that directory into the right directory. So let's clear the screen. I need to change into the project directory. So we'll do that with cd htdocs. And once we're in there, we can type composer install. And now that's done, all we need to do is run this clear cache. I don't think strictly you need to do it on first install, but if you're doing an update, then you do need to clear it because it has some old bits and pieces in there. And that's how you install using Git. In the next lecture, we'll talk about how to do it directly with Composer. In the last lecture, we installed this project, my password generator, using Git. In this lecture, I'm going to show you the same thing, but with Composer. So let's copy and paste that command. And what we need to do is we need to connect to the server as the website. And as always, I'm going to be removing the htdocs directory. Ooh. If you ever get that, and you probably will with Git, you can use -f in there as well to force it. Okay. And we could just run that, just like the git clone command. But also, like the git clone command, we can put a directory at the end. So let's just put htdocs. It'll save us renaming it later. And what this is going to do is it's going to look up the project, it's going to download it, and it's also going to do the Composer install at the same time. And there you go, there's all the dependencies going. So it's actually combining two steps in one. We can just hit enter for these defaults. So whichever way you want to install it, it doesn't matter, but you now know the fourth way that I can install an app. I'll see you in the next lecture. In this section, we are going to talk about Nginx config. I'm going to break it down into various lectures. So a lecture for static content, a lecture for PHP content. So just like the other sections, you'll be able to pick which one applies to you or cherry pick bits of config from various ones. But it's not all going to apply to each and every website. There's no point including the ability to process PHP if it's a static website. And if there's a framework that I've missed, then drop it in the comments, and if there's enough demand, I will do one for that as well. So you've gone to the trouble and you've made a static website. Let's connect to the server. And what we need to do is we need to go to our Nginx folder. Okay, so at the moment we have no config except for our default page. And if we have a look in that, because there was a lot of interesting bits, the bit we really are interested in is this last bit at the end, this server block. So what I want to do is I want to copy that, and we're going to create a new file. We're going to name it the same as our domain name, following the username pattern. And we'll paste that in. Now, anything that has a hash is a comment. So we need to remove all those. And we need to give it the correct name. So I was going with example.ofdan.com. And this is your server name, whatever domain name that you've got pointing at the IP address of your server. If you don't have a domain name, then you can specify the IP address, or you can edit your host files and point anything at your server IP address. But I'm going to assume you have a domain name. And this would be the directory. And that's what it should be. And then you just need a location block that matches everything. And if something doesn't exist, just returns a 404. So if we save that, Control X, Y, hit enter. Now we've created this site, we haven't linked it up yet. So what we need to do is we need to go into your sites enabled, and in there we still need to create a symlink. So what we need to do is we need to type the path to that file we've just created, and like that. We can hit enter. It's going to use exactly the same name. And now if we look in there, we can see that the file is pointing to, in Windows terms, it's just a shortcut or an alias on the Mac. But in terms of Linux, it's called a symbolic link. And once we've done that, we just need to do Nginx reload. And then you get a 404. And then you get a 403. Okay. But if we were to try and search for something, right, okay. What we need to do is if we log into that user, and whilst I'm here, I'm just going to remove the htdocs because there is nothing in there. Make directory htdocs. So we've got a clean slate. So if we create that index file like so, and then we reload the page, it's working. Why did we get a 403? Well, I suspect that's because if we look back at the actual file, we weren't looking for a file, we were just doing slash. And this index tells the Nginx to sort of say, if you don't get a file, substitute it with this. And because it didn't exist, I suspect it's going to be that the default file causes a 403. But any other missing file will be a 404. And you could see that when I typed in index.html, that it then changed to a 404. So that's how you serve static files. You want to be careful with this, because I'm sure if we were to then create a file called, let's create for example, an SSH folder, and inside there and we type in that file we've just created, okay, it's just downloaded it. But it's worked. So you've got to be careful with the static one because it just shows you everything. There is no security, there's no filter. We will sort this out later with snippets, but just bear this in mind. And this is another reason why I use a htdocs rather than dumping you straight into the user folder, because there's so many folders and files. I mean, you can see in this folder here, you've got caches, configs, all sorts that even your bash history would be a terrible one for somebody to get hold of. So just know that this Nginx config will let somebody download absolutely everything in that folder. I'll see you in the next lecture. First thing we'll do is we'll log back into root, and then we can set up the config, because it's a lot easier to set up the config once you've deployed your website. And what we want to do is, it doesn't matter at this point whether we're doing our sites enabled or available, because we've already set up the symlink. If we were setting up a new site, then yes, you'd have to go in var available and then symlink that once you're done. So our index file is PHP. So if there is nothing on the URL, then we need to enter, it needs to default to index.php. There's no harm in leaving the index.html, because if you wanted to turn off the website for some reason, then you could. But there's also no harm in just having index. And then index.php. I'm going to paste it in here. And this is just saying that if a file is PHP, or the file extension is PHP, then include this file. It just does a bit of setting up of PHP and how to connect to PHP. And this is something we set up when we set up the PHP config earlier. And this will be one per website. So the pattern we were using was, this was your website. And that's it. I mean, you could do without this location block, but this also helps us serve our static assets. And even though you've got a PHP website, you still need some images, some CSS, and that's what's going to be serving those files. So if we quit and save, and because we've changed the config, we still need to reload the Nginx. And now, if we go to the actual website, it will redirect us to WordPress's setup. So if we click continue, it just tells us we need to set up the config. So our details from earlier was ofdan_example for the database name, and also the username, and the password was the one we specified as well. Table prefix is an interesting one. If you want to run multiple WordPresses in the same database, then you need to use a different prefix. You could go as simple as WordPress 1, WordPress 2, etc. However, it's also a good idea to use different prefixes, because if you're being attacked, then a lot of assumptions are going to be made and people are going to assume you're using the same table prefix. It's not going to stop everything, but it's more of a speed bump. So it's worth changing it. Probably something a bit more complex than that, but... And then we just run the installation. And there you go. It's a very simple system. In a later section, we'll talk about how to customize this to make it a bit more secure and a bit more rich with like redirects. I was asked recently, how do you set up WordPress multi-user? So in this lecture, we're going to cover that. So we're going to assume nothing. We're going to remove the htdocs and re-download WordPress, just like we did in the last lecture, using tar to extract the files. A little bit of housekeeping, remove the download and rename the WordPress directory into the htdocs directory. So now when we look in the htdocs directory, you can see all the WordPress files. So just like before, let's run through the WordPress installation. I'm going to use the same details as I did before. So the same database name, the same username, the same password. I'm using a different table prefix here, so it doesn't conflict with an earlier installation attempt. So let's run the installation. So let's set up the site. First by giving it a name. Then I'm copying the password for later use. Specify your email address. And because this is a test site, I'm discouraging the search engines from crawling this website. I've forgotten to enter my username, so let's fix that now. Let's not forget to copy the new password that's been generated. Again, tick the box that disables search engine visibility. Latest version of macOS. When you choose your user, it auto submits the form, which is handy unless you forgot to update your password on the previous page. So we're now at the stage where we were in the previous lecture. We've got WordPress installed. So let's update the config file on the file system to say that we want to allow the multi-user setup. First thing we need to do is scroll down to the bit that says that's all. You can stop editing. And we just need to define another constant. So we need to write define open brackets, single quote, WP underscore allow underscore multi-site, close quote, comma, true, close brackets, semicolon. We need to save the file and just reload the web page. So let's get the browser back here, and we're going to make it a little bit bigger so the menu's on the left hand side as well. And now we need to go into network setup, which is in tools. Now we need to decide whether we're going to do it as a subdomain or a subdirectory, like the examples given. I'm going to select subdomains, and then all we need to do is click install. Just like we did with the constant allow multi-site, we now need to copy and paste these into our WP config file. So let's do that now. Scroll down to the bottom, and let's just put it in after the allow, and then save again. That's done. We're going to skip the htaccess bit because we're using Nginx and it doesn't support htaccess files. So we've made all these changes. We're going to have to log in again. So let's click on the link and do that now. The first change, as you can see, is there's now a My Sites option. Let's go to the network admin, click on Sites, and then we can see all the sites that have been defined. As expected, there's only one, the one we defined earlier. So let's create a new site. You'll need to enter a subdomain of your primary domain name. This doesn't have to be the final domain name because we can change that later. For the moment, I'm going to assume we want to use test.ovdan.com. Regardless of what we're entering here, whether it's a subdomain or a new domain name, we need Nginx to respond on that domain name. You will also need to make sure that the DNS is pointing at your server, but that's beyond the scope of this lecture. So we need to disconnect from the server and reconnect again as root, because we're going to be changing the Nginx config. And you need to edit the Nginx config for this particular site. So in our case, ovdan_example. Now the server already listens on example.ovdan.com. However, we just need to put in our test.example.ovdan.com here. Alternatively, if you were using a completely custom domain name, you'd put myawesomeblog.com there instead. In fact, you can have as many domain names listed there as you want. If you're happy by using subdomains, then what we can do is actually change test to a star. And assume you've got wildcard DNS set up, then all possible domain names or subdomain names will work. As we've made an Nginx change, don't forget to reload the Nginx config. If you're happy with subdomains, put the correct subdomain name in here. If you're trying to use a custom domain name, just put something in as a placeholder, but fill out the rest of the information correctly. And then click Add Site. Now we can open up a new tab, paste in our domain name or subdomain name, and you can see it working. We can also enter in an invalid domain name, and because the DNS and the Nginx is set up correctly, it will still go to WordPress. However, it won't work because WordPress isn't aware of that subdomain and it hasn't been set up. If you did want to enable registrations, then click on Options and then choose the correct option here. However, that's not something I want to cover in this lecture. Okay, so maybe you want a custom domain name. Let's go back to our site, and in here you can now actually change the URL to anything you want. So in my case, ovdan.co.uk. Any domain name in there you like, as long as the DNS is pointing at your server and the Nginx has been set up. One thing I noticed with my testing was that I couldn't actually create any new posts or update any posts because there's something wrong with the Nginx config that I've been using. So when I click publish, I just get publishing failed. And if you look at the console, and if you go into the errors, you can see that I think around version 5.0 of WordPress, they started using parameters on the URLs. So things after the question mark. And that's what's going on here. Because my Nginx config wasn't expecting that. So let's fix it. We need to go back into our Nginx config for ovdan_example, and we need to go down to the try files, and instead of returning a 404, we need to pass it through to index.php and also give it the arguments. Here is args is actually either a question mark or not. So if there's any args, then the is args will actually be a question mark, and then args will be the actual values. Otherwise you'll end up with everything being empty and you'll just have index.php. As always, we need to save that file and then reload the Nginx service. Now, when we hit publish again, there you can see it's worked. The only downside to this is if you go to an image that doesn't exist, you'll end up serving the error page of the WordPress site. That's it for deploying WordPress to Nginx using multi-site. I'll see you in the next lecture. Let's get Nginx working with Symfony. So we'll log in, we'll just double check the website's all set up. And what we'll do is just do that. Okay, so we have a Symfony project. And now let's log in as root. And let's check to see what happens when we try to use it now. So we're getting forbidden. First thing we need to remember with Symfony is that it uses a public folder. So whilst the project lives in htdocs, its entry point for the web server is actually in the public folder. So if we reload that, Nginx reload, and now the difference with Nginx and PHP is that Wordpress doesn't try to manipulate the URL. Every bit that you access in WordPress is a discrete PHP file. With Symfony and other frameworks, they'll run everything through an index.php. So in the URL, you've got /en. That needs to be run through the PHP. So let's go into the config and sort that out. In fact, actually, let's go to Symfony's documentation. On Symfony's website, there's lots of great documentation. And what I'll do is I'll link you to the right section so that you don't have to type it in manually. But when you're doing this, you need to ask yourself a question. Which version of Symfony are you using? If you're using 2 or 3, or if you have a web directory, then you want version 3.4 of this document. If you have a public folder, or version 4, then you want version 4. I'll link to both. It'll be simple. Now I know that I need this version for my project. And what you need to do is go down to the Nginx section. And what I'm going to do is we're going to copy and paste this file and we'll make the modifications ourselves. Because a lot of it we've already done. We go down the bottom. I haven't covered this before, but your error log and your access log, it's always a good idea to give it a name. So in my case, I like to stick with the actual website name. Because there's nothing worse than trying to track down a bug with the error log and it's all mushed into one file. So we scroll up. Oh yes, you do have parameters, but in my particular application, we don't have any. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut that line, Control K, and I want to put it there, Control U. And we'll get rid of that line. That's just our socket. And what we'll do is we'll also get rid of all these lines. So what you end up with is an amalgamation of the two that we had. It's the Symfony one, but with our URL. I will also put this in the resources for you. Okay, so we'll save that. We'll reload Nginx and hopefully we'll be somewhere better off. And there you go. And that was pretty simple. One thing I will go back to is actually that config, because we need to run that app in prod. You can tell it's in dev mode because you've got the debug toolbar. And you should never be running a Symfony app in dev mode in production. So that's a big no-no. So back in our config, what we want to do is find the parameter app_env, and that just means the environment. And we'll delete that hash symbol, and it will just tell it to be in prod mode. So we'll save and reload the config, and hopefully we reload now. This was unexpected. Now I've just checked, and it's because I haven't specified all the parameters in the Nginx config. So let's specify them all. I mean, how do we know what the parameters are? Well, I mean, this is only a Symfony 4 thing, so if you're using Symfony 3 or less, then you're not going to have this problem because they're all specified within the project. Inside the Symfony projects, there's a .env file. The dist one is the thing that gets distributed, and the env one is the one that's been, I think, generated when Composer installed it. So let's check the env one. So we can see it wants app env, app secret, and another one called GA tracking. So let's make sure that they're specified. Well, app secret is already defined, but commented out. And we specify app GA tracking there. I don't know if that's going to work, so let's try that instead. And now, there we go. No, we don't. Mostly works. Oh, let's quickly check. I can show you how I check the logs. So the app itself has got logs, and they are in var log prod, and that's within the htdocs. Okay, it's just a bug in my code, a file not found. So that is how you install Symfony. Once you get the hang of it, it's straightforward. And personally, I felt the old way was a bit easier, but I'm showing you the new way because going forward, that's what it's going to be. But drop a line in the comments if you've got any problems. I'll see you in the next lecture. By now, you've seen all the different Nginx configs to get you started with whichever your PHP project is, whether it's a static site, WordPress, or Symfony. But maybe you want to take it a little bit further. And this is what this section's all about, is adding a few snippets of code to allow you to do a bit more, whether it's to restrict a directory to a particular user, or have redirects, whether it's for a domain name or just a URL. And then you can manage that all within Nginx, and your application doesn't need to worry about it. And a lot of time I find this a lot more convenient than trying to find a plugin that does a redirect for WordPress, or add some code to Symfony to lock down a particular directory. This section can't be exhaustive because there are so many different types of code. There's so many different types of Nginx config that exists. So I'm trying to give you a taste, and if there's something else you want me to add, then drop me a line, drop me a message in the Q&A, and I should be able to add something in here. I'll see you in the next lecture. Suppose you're launching a new site, or your site's not quite ready, but you need somebody to look it over, or maybe it's a third party you want to check your website, but you don't want the world to be able to access your new website. What you can do is you can put a password on it, or multiple passwords, or multiple users with passwords. And that's called user auth. And what we can do is do this for the whole site. So every request to a particular domain name will be prompted with a password, or prompted for a username and password, or you can use it on a specific folder. So let's jump in. So let's say for some reason I wanted to secure this computer password generator and leave the other ones accessible. Well, we can do that. But first, let's make the whole site password protected. Actually, the first thing we need to do is we need a user and a user file. And what I tend to do is I put them outside of the Nginx directory because of permissions. So I created a folder called htpassword. Okay, so we've already got something in there. So that I know what's going on, because otherwise you'll end up with, trust me, you'll end up with loads of users in files that you don't know what they're for. We need to create a user file. And the format's going to be username : encoded password. But that's a bit tricky and I don't really like managing it that way. So there's a script that helps us. And it's called htpassword. And it comes from the Apache side of things, but Nginx and Apache share the same password file, so 9 times out of 10 they're going to be compatible. And so what we need to do is install the actual utilities, and it's called Apache 2 utils. And we'll install that. And use it like this. You type htpassword, and -c is for create. If the file already exists, then you don't need the -c. And then just the name of the file. And I personally would stick with the format, but it's entirely up to you. And then the username. So we're saying create a password file and add this user, and it'll prompt us for the password, and it'll ask to confirm it, and there you go, it's written it. So let's just have a quick look, and that's just the format. And as I say, if you wanted to add a different user, then you can do that. Okay, we've got this. We've got the password file. What can we do with it? Well, let's just copy and paste that URL or that file so we don't have to worry about it. And let's go into the Nginx config. So this is our config, and how do we do it? Well, depends what we want to do. Do we want to make the entire server protected? If we did, then we can just type auth basic and then give it it's kind of a title. This will be what the password prompt has in it. So, and then we just need to tell it the file with all the passwords in it. Because if we don't, then we're never going to be able to succeed at this, and you'll always get blocked. And then just paste that in, not forgetting the semicolon. And we save, and we'll do a quick reload of Nginx. And there you go. That's every request will be blocked. But maybe we just want one area to be blocked. Maybe let's try the computer section. So we can say, obviously this would only block the English version, but and that would work, but it's not. The trouble with this is it's going to block it. Perfect. If you pass this, it's then still not going to work because we've kind of bypassed this section. So we need to add the try files back in. And if we reload that, we're still prompted for a password on that section, but it's literally only the computer section we're now asked for the password. When I set up a new website, one of the first few things I ask after what's its domain name is it going to be with or without W's? And what do I mean by that? Do you want the website to be domainname.com or do you want it to be www.domainname.com? With or without the W's? It's an important question for SEO, but I'll tell you how you can solve it from a technical point. For the purposes of this, I've created a new domain name and it's called www.example.ovdan.com. So I'm going to tell you how to redirect one to the other. Well, the fact that we've been using example.ovdan.com suggests that that's the canonical domain name. So we'll redirect the W's to the non-W domain name. So let's go straight in there. And this is going to be one of the simplest ones I've ever done because all you need to do is tell Nginx to listen. So all we need is another server block because we're not going to faff around by saying if the host name equals this, then redirect inside the existing server block, because then it has to do it on every single request. Why not say, if you see this server name, then redirect? And that's exactly what we're going to do. So what we need is those lines. So we might as well save time. But obviously we need the W version. And then all we need to do is type rewrite. We want to match everything and we want to send it over to example.ovdan.com. Now, do you want to send it with the request URL? So if somebody went to www.example.ovdan.com/hello, do you want that hello portion to be redirected along with it? If it's a new domain name, the chances are no. If you're moving all your content from one domain name to another domain name, then the chances are yes. So I'm going to show you how to do it. If you didn't, then you can ignore this particular variable. Because you literally could just stop at example.ovdan.com and not include the $request URI ? And then we just tell it what type of redirect we want. And in this case, we want a permanent redirect. And then that's it. That'll redirect you. You can use this as a regular expression where the hat symbol is, or you can use a slightly different version, which I believe is slightly more efficient, and it's just the return. So you tell Nginx what status code to return, and in this case the URL to go along with it. So you can use either one of those. So let's save that. Nginx, reload. And I can show you in the web browser, but chances are it's going to be quite difficult to see. So let's just try it on the terminal. example.ofdan.com / well, let's go with actually about. And there you go. You can see the HTTP recode 301 has been returned and the location, it's there. And that is the request URI. You could also in here have more than one. So and you can have as many domain names as you like, all being captured and then redirecting you onto your main one. So that's it for domain name redirects. We'll go a little bit more in depth into actual redirects for the URI one later on. Previously, we covered redirecting domain names, but what about if it's just a URL you want? You could easily use location blocks to set up your redirects. So let's have a quick look. So this is what we did in the last lecture. But if we scroll down, so what I've got here is I've got two tabs. One is the editor for my ovdan example, the Nginx config, and the other is just on the shell. And the second tab is going to be used for just reloading Nginx. And I've got a third tab that I can use to see the results of the redirects. So if you had a URL, old location, like this, what you could do is you could have location equals old location, and then we could return a 301. I'm going to use scheme $host new location. So we'll save that. Reload that, and we'll see what happens. And there you can see it's redirected us to the new location. Well, maybe everything from one directory, or maybe the directory itself is being moved. Obviously this equals sign means an exact match, but maybe the old directory is moving, in which case we could say request URI, and that would put the old directory and everything in it within the new directory. So we can give that a try. And there you go. Oh, we've messed up with the slashes, but still. The thing is, the request URI has the slash in it, so we wouldn't need to put the slash there. But hopefully you're getting a little bit of the idea. The trouble is, what happens if you want to rename old to new, but keep everything else the same? It's a little bit difficult to do it with the location blocks. What we need is a little bit more control. Nginx supports something called rewrites. and they use regular expressions. If you've never come across regular expressions before, then you're in luck. I'm going to give you a brief overview of them. They can look very intimidating, but I promise you, give them a chance. You can cherry pick the bits you need, and they're amazing. So why don't we give this a go? So what we need to do is type rewrite. Instead of return, it's rewrite. And we use the caret symbol to say the start. And we want /old. And anything in these brackets is a match. And we can use that later. Dot matches absolutely anything. It's a special character. And along with the plus. And the plus means one or more. And we'll use the dollar symbol to say that that's the end. So hopefully you get that everything between the beginning and end is either going to be the old or it's going to be stuck in this match. And what we're going to do is we're going to do the same URL as before, like this. But this time we're going to use the match. And the matches are counted. So the first bracket is 1, the second brackets are 2, and in this case we only have 1, so that's all we can use. And let's just put permanent there. And we don't need that anymore. As we've made quite a bit of a change, let's just double check that with a config test. And to save me keep rewriting it, we can always do it at exactly the same time. And there we go. I've done the URL of old location, and this time it's redirected us to new location. It's pretty cool. But looking at this, did we need the location block? No, but it's a good way to group things up. If we would have multiple rewrite rules in there, all doing the old URL, and I will give you a couple of examples later, then you could group them up that way. It will also only do the rewrite when you're in the location old. And regular expressions can be a bit expensive in computing terms, whereas the location blocks are a lot simpler. So it's going to help with performance. Where possible, use location blocks to try and simplify, to try and group up your rewrite rules. It's not always going to be possible, but give it a go. It'll help with performance. The permanent in this rewrite, do you know what it means? Permanent tells Nginx to return HTTP code 301, which just says it's been moved permanently. We could say redirect, and that tells Nginx to return HTTP code 302 found. Use redirect when testing. It won't be cached by your browser, and later on it won't be cached by search engines. Use permanent if you want the search engine to update their records. So if they found old location, they would then update it to new location, and they would stop checking old location. It's not guaranteed that'll happen, but it's a good start. In the past, I've had newsletters on my server. Something along the lines of newsletter 2018 01 05. And I wanted to reorganize. And in this example, maybe I wanted to group everything up into folders. Like this. I mean, a reason for this could be that you've got far too many newsletters, or it's possible images. And if you get more than a few hundred images or files in a folder, the performance of searching that folder becomes astronomical for the web browser, for you, for your FTP client, etc. This isn't a far-stretched example. So how would you do that? There's obviously the manual effort of moving all the newsletters. But once you do that, how do you redirect all the URLs? You're probably thinking a rewrite rule, and you'd be right. But because this is a little expensive, I'm going to wrap it in a location block. So we want rewrite, caret to say the start, / newsletter, because everything's got to match newsletter. And we want a match. Now, how do we say numbers? Well, these square brackets is a matching group. And what you can do is inside there, you can say 0 through to 9. And that'll match all the numbers in between as well. That's a single digit. And we can use the plus to say 1 or more. And then we can use the dash. And if we do that 3 times, that matches our format pretty closely. I'm not worried about it matching exactly. If we really wanted to, we could say there's four digits, followed by 2 digits, followed by 2 digits. But this is close enough. And that's the end of the URL. And what we need to do is we need to give it a destination. So the destination would look something like this. Do you remember how to get the matches? Well, that was just $1, $2, and $3. And in this case, let's just make it a redirect. So we'll save that. Let's take our example here. Reload Nginx. And we give it the newsletter URL. And there you go, just like that, the URL has been updated. It's cool, huh? Another example of a rewrite I had was something like this. And this might look different. So this is a matching group from here to here. But this little pipe symbol means OR. So if it sees the start of the URL, about or contact or private policy, and then the absolute end, it's going to redirect it to the same URL, but with a trailing slash. This one was a lot harder to put in a location block, so I haven't. So if we reload, and for this one, let's use about, and there you go. You've got it with the slash. Another example I had was I had sitemaps, and for some reason people were accessing my site using sitemap with a capital S or a lowercase s. I don't know if it's a standard or something, or maybe it's just convention that some browsers do this, or website crawlers. So I've rewritten sitemap with an S, which is uppercase or lowercase, and that's what this grouping is doing. So where before we did 0 to 9, you can actually just specify actual individual characters or digits. And I just redirected that to sitemap.xml. It was pretty simple. I do recommend that you check your error log. You'll find lots of weird and wonderful URLs that people are trying to access. And some of it's legitimate, some of it's a broken client. And I like to help them out sometimes and point them in the actual direction of the content. One of the weird things I found was somebody accessing my cookie policy, but it looked like the title of the link tag. So they had cookie space policy. So I redirected them. And this is, I don't know if you've come across this before, this is called URL encoding. And that %20 is just the equivalent of a space. I was also moving a website to WordPress. So you had URLs a bit like this. Save-money /at home, or save money at home selling for others. The at home was a category, and the selling for others was the page slug. Now, I could have done this one at a time with location blocks, but regular expression just made this so much easier. So I ended up with something like this. Now, this might look weird, but my category was categories / save money / at home. But when it came to the page slug, I only needed this part to double check things. This question mark here, which I don't think I've used before, means 0 or 1. So it means that slash there, that / is optional. That is regular expressions. You can do them, you can use them, and it's all good. But with regular expressions, there is so much more to learn. Also, sometimes maybe you're not getting the regular expression just right. Maybe you're struggling a little bit. So how is it you can debug them? Well, there's a website I like to use, and it's called regex 101. Oh yes. In regular expressions, outside of Nginx, have got delimiters, and by default it's the /. So you'll need to change it to something else. Anything else, to be fair. And that way the regular expression can work. So if we grab our URL, this one, we paste it in there. So you can see it fully matches, which is the blue. It's the whole thing. But the match, the $1, is this bit in green. So here. If that question mark wasn't there, the URL wouldn't match. You can also see here how long and how many steps this regular expression took to parse. So you can imagine if you had like 100 of these, they would sort of add up to like half a second. You do have a little reference down here. So there you go. Single character, excluding character. Not all of these are going to be compatible with Nginx, but it's a good place to get started. I'll put a link to this website in the notes, and I'll also link you to URL encoding. If you've got any problems, then put them in the Q&A, and I'll see you in the next lecture. There's a huge movement on the internet to make all the websites have HTTPS by default. And there's an organisation called Let's Encrypt that is pushing for everybody to do this. But if certificates cost money, then no one's going to rush to do it. However, what they've done are issued short certificates that are very easy to renew for free. And I'm going to tell you how to do it. And this is something I'm using on all my websites. And because it's so easy, it takes less time than if I was to buy a certificate and install it. Now, there's a website I'm using called Certbot that tells me how to install Certbot properly. And there's a lot of information here, but it's mostly just plugging away. So I'm going to copy and paste some of that information in. So let's connect to the server. No, we're already connected. What we need to do is type add apt repository, and it's PPA certbot / certbot. And then a quick apt update. And I'm pretty sure I don't want their Nginx version. I just want the actual executable myself. So I'm going to type apt install certbot, and I'll show you how to use it. I'm not particularly interested in getting certbot to modify Nginx for me. So let's install that. Excellent. Now we could use certbot directly, and what it would be is you'd do it something like this. And then you would basically say the directory is, in this case, yeah. We also need cert only. And then we'd say domain name. I would choose the primary domain name first, and then followed by any secondary ones you want. I think you are limited to like 50 domain names in one certificate, so. And that would work perfectly well. But I don't tend to like that, because it will create a .well-known folder inside your htdocs public folder. And for me, that interferes a little bit with Git. I like to have a catch-all system that puts all your certificate requests or your challenges in its own folder inside your var www directory. I'm not going to worry about that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make this directory. I call it certbot. And if we go into our Nginx directory and inside snippets, I'm going to create a file called certbot.conf. And what we're going to put in here is something is to match all requests. And this is going to match all requests that come along to the .well-known folder and Acme challenge, and it's going to allow everybody, because maybe we've got authorization turned on at a lower level, but we need this to always work. We also need to tell it that regardless of what's in here, the default type is plain text. And we're going to override the root to tell it that everything is inside this certbot folder. And then we're going to say try files. It needs to be the request URI or just 404. And finally, if the location is exactly equal to this well-known folder, Acme challenge, then we want to just return 404, because it needs to be looking for a specific file for it to actually be a proper authentication. And then all we need to do is include this file everywhere we want to. So let's go. We're going to put it everywhere because it's going to keep it easy. So we're just saying inside the default file that if it sees this request, then great. And again, in here. Because the thing is, in the previous example, before using this, you'd have to set up the web server. And then the web root needed to be set up as well for it to work. With this, because we're also doing it to the default one, the default page, we can do this authorization request before setting up the website. As long as the as long as the DNS is pointed to this server, it'll work. And then we reload. And now we can use the same command again, but instead of knowing exactly where the directory is, we can just put certbot. And it doesn't matter that we then set it up again, or we've set it up and moved the folder, because it's always going to be this folder. We need to give an email address so that Let's Encrypt can get in touch with you. They send it just in case when a certificate's running out, or if they're going to do something that's going to cause a problem. Mostly it's about certificates that I've abandoned. They're going to expire in the next day or two. So I wouldn't worry too much about it being spammed. And then you have to read their terms and conditions. And once you have, and you're happy with them, then you can agree. And you want them to share your email address. It's up to you. And there you go. You can see that I've been granted a new certificate. And the private key is there, and the actual certificate is there. So save those URLs, because we're going to need them in a minute. Now that we've got it, let's turn it on. How do you enable HTTPS in Nginx? Well, it's pretty simple, but it also comes down to how do you want it set up. Now, we can very easily just put more listen blocks in here. Just like that, and it will start working. But do you want to? Because you will then have a website that works on HTTP and HTTPS. What I'm advocating is have your website listen on the main website listen on HTTPS, but redirect any non-ones back. So what we can do, we change that. When you're enabling HTTPS, you'll need to specify your SSL certificate, like so. And you'll also need to specify your SSL certificate key. And that was privkey.pem. And that's it for that. Let's go back up to these two. So, and if we add these, yes, we're also missing a server name. So what have I done? Why have I done it? Well, I've created an additional block, which is this second one. Nginx gets very confused if you try to listen on the same server name on multiple server blocks. It's always best to be as specific as possible. And by that, I'm saying server name example.ovdan.com, it would get very confused if you start listening on the same port on multiple blocks. So I've split them out, and I've got one on HTTPS and one on port 80, HTTP. That way I can clearly say, if it comes in on HTTP, redirect it to HTTPS. So why has this block got both in it? Because I don't care. Because regardless of whether they come in on HTTP or HTTPS, I want them redirected to example.ovdan.com. Matter. Hopefully that makes sense. And if we save that, it's always best to do a config test if you're not 100% sure. Okay, something's failed, not sure what. There are more efficient ways to find out, but this is the quickest way. Okay, so I've missed. I've mistyped it. Let's reload. Okay. Apologies for that. I imagine a few of you saw that. And again, probably the easiest way to show this is if I use curl, because I imagine everybody knows what a web browser looks like, but trying to see a redirect is pretty annoying. We're going to go to the HTTP version, and it's going to be with W's. So I expect it to redirect to https example.ovdan.com. And there you go. So the redirect's working fine. And there you go. The actual certificate with a padlock is there. With this system, a cron job should have been installed and it will automatically try to renew this certificate. And don't worry too much about the certificate getting a bit out of date, because when you first register, you get 90 days. It's only until about day 27, day 28 that the certificate will start to renew. If the certificate has less time than that, then something's gone wrong. And you can manually do it yourself by doing certbot renew. And then you can see that's the date it's going to expire and it's been skipped. And that is the reason why. I personally use a website to monitor my SSL certificate. And I call it Track SSL. It doesn't cost a lot and you get 2 free domain names, so that's who I personally use. I'm not affiliated with them, but it's up to you. You don't need to. Heck, you could write your own. But I just personally like getting an email when the certificates have been renewed or they're close to expiring. Hopefully that will help you get all your websites enabled with HTTPS. I'll see you in the next lecture. Even with the best will in the world, you can make mistakes. You can expose something you shouldn't have exposed in configuration in your Ubuntu setup. So we can install something called a firewall, or in this case, set up something called a firewall. You can have the firewall installed on your actual server using something called IP tables or UFW. But I'm going to talk about DigitalOcean's firewall because it's free when you've got a server and it's a lot easier to use. And if you get it wrong, then it's a lot easier to fix. It's hard to fix a firewall when you've locked yourself out of the server. So let's log into DigitalOcean. And let's go into the server. Let's go into networking. And click Manage Firewalls. And what we need to do is create a firewall. I'm going to call it example.ovdan.com. You could also call it web server, because this will be a firewall you can apply to more than one server. Now, a firewall can do two things. It can filter your traffic inbound, or it can filter it going outbound, or both. I'm not too worried about outbound. If you knew your server was only ever going to connect to web servers, then you could put port 80 on these, but on your outbound, but it's not, from my point of view, I've not worried too much about it. It's your inbound rules and what services do you want to allow. So by default, we obviously need SSH because otherwise we're not going to be able to get in. If you had a fixed IP address, then you could remove these and then type in your fixed IP address. Ooh. And then remove all these, and then only you could get SSH into your server. But as you're unlikely to have a fixed IP address, or let's assume that you don't, and I don't, we'll have to leave it open. But with secure keys, we should be okay. And as we're doing a web server, we're going to need HTTP. And you may need HTTPS. And if you want to be able to ping the server, you want ICMP. And that's all you need. If you've installed a mail server by accident and you've left it world accessible, the world's not going to be able to get to it because of this firewall rule. And then we just need to say which server we're going to apply it to. You can either do it by tag or by host name. So it doesn't really matter for us because they're both the same server. And then you go create firewall. And now you have a firewall that is sorted out and it's managed by DigitalOcean. And if for some reason you accidentally removed the SSH access, you can add it back in. If you did that using IP tables, then you're going to have to go through a lot more steps to re-add it. So I highly recommend you use a firewall. I'll see you in the next lecture. If you want to make an insecure server, the quickest way to do it is to install as many things as possible, turn on as many things as possible. Because at least one of those things is going to end up with a security hole that allows an attacker in. So the reverse is true. The less you install, the harder it is for an attacker to attack you. But for a web server, you kind of need a web server. And you need PHP. What you need to do is expose as little as possible. And what we're going to do is we're going to log into the server as the user and see what we can see. So the idea is we're locked into this directory, but we're not fully locked in because we can see what's below us. We can also see the Nginx config, which is not ideal because if an attacker breaks into your website, then they're going to be able to not necessarily break out of your user, but they can get a good idea of what's on here, what they need. They can see which sites are available, what the config is, and then have a better understanding of how to attack you. So let's try to solve these problems, and let's try to expose as little as possible. So what are the permissions on var www? So we can see the world has read access and execute access. So how can we fix this? Well, in Linux, all files and folders have permissions. And the directory ones are slightly different to the file ones. The file ones, you've got read, write, and execute. Read is sort of like being able to look at the contents of the file. Write is obviously changing the contents, and execute is allow the contents of the file to be run as a program. With a directory, you've still got the same permissions, but read is list the contents of a directory. Write is, I think, just changing the file name or the directory name. And execute is being able to change into that directory. So let's log out and go back into the root user, because we can't change the permissions from a lower user. So what we need to do is, the user and group is fine, but for the other user, we need to remove the read permissions from var www. You also need to change the group to www.data, otherwise Nginx will not be able to get into that folder. So you just type chgrp space www-data space and then /var/www/html. Unfortunately, we can't remove the execute permissions because all the users need to go through the var www directory. But we can do that for Nginx. In fact, let's go up a directory. So we type chmod other user minus read and execute. In fact, actually, I'll show you just read for Nginx and PHP. And now, if we log in as that user, if we look at the var www directory, we have no permission. I mean, it's still a little bit insecure because it will tell us we have no permission to do something rather than tell us that it doesn't exist. And also at the moment, we can log into the HTML directory, which is our default page. So we can fix that. So other read and execute on var www HTML. And then if we try to change into that directory, it's permission denied. But if we try to log into a directory that didn't exist, so that could give an attacker an advantage. However, it will take them a while, and it depends on what level you want to go. If you really wanted to make it harder, then you would choose directory names that made no sense, but it's trade-offs between ease of use and security. So I'm just trying to give you the best security, but without making too many trade-offs, because we still need to be able to use the server. So, back to Nginx. Obviously we've removed the read permission, so we can't list the contents of that folder. But we can still access the files in it, even if we have no idea what's in there. So we need to remove the execute permission as well. And so other -x Nginx, and now if we try to change into there, we get permission denied. And again, if we try to do Nginx, nginx.conf, again, permission denied. That's going to make it incredibly hard for somebody to figure out what websites you're running and how easy it is to attack you. And out of all these things, the PHP and the Nginx ones are the best ones to do. So the best thing to do is log in as your user and see what you can access and figure out, does it matter? How could you attack the system with this knowledge? I'd like to thank you for joining me on this journey of creating a web server running PHP. You can do a lot with this, and this is something I use on a daily basis for my company's needs. We have a few servers running this config, and it's pretty much the same config as it has been for the last couple of years. There have been a few tweaks, and you'll have benefited from the extra tweaks in this course. And it's withstood many an attack. And as I've said at the beginning, the only thing that's ever got through is Wordpress. And that's because there's been a bug in the application, which, if you're careful and you keep it updated, you're not going to have a problem with. If you need anything else from the course, ask in the Q&A, and if there's a particular framework you want me to cover, then I can add that in as well. Thank you again, and I look forward to hearing from you.